Should we get going here? All right. Let's ask the Lord to bless our time. Heavenly Father, thank you for just the beautiful sunshine out there. It's just a reminder constantly. We can look up into the sky and we can't hardly look at the sun without looking away. It reminds us of your glory that one day we'll be able to see. And we look forward to that. And Lord, as you tarry coming for us, we ask that you'd open our hearts and our ears and our minds to the teaching and preaching and the singing and worship of your word. Pray, Father, that we leave this place not merely hearers, but doers of the word. We ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so last week we finished up Daniel chapter 1 and just kind of the real quick summary. Nebuchadnezzar seized Jerusalem, took some articles from the temple, took some young Jewish men, and his plan was to train them in the language and literature of the Babylonians so that they would serve in his court. And the whole context here is really the Babylonian exile. So one of the themes and one of the basic issues in the book is how now were the Jews to view all of these promises that God made to them concerning the kingdom. Okay, we know from David, his promise to David that the kingdom was to be everlasting. How were they now to view all these promises in light of their own exile? Okay, did they misunderstand what God meant by that? Did they not have a correct interpretation or understanding of what he said to David and stuff? And God is going to put all of that to bed in the book of Daniel and explain the nature of the kingdom and the clarity of it. So that's kind of a recurring theme in the book. Now, one of the things that we want to, before we go into chapter 2, and chapter 2 is one of the most important chapters in the book of Daniel, probably the most important chapter. If you don't get the interpretation of Daniel 2 right, you're going to make mistakes throughout the rest of the book. Your eschatology is going to be off, and in some places, you could make severe mistakes. So one of the things that we kind of want to keep in mind and that we want to avoid doing is we want to forget that we know anything about the book of Revelation or Matthew 24 and 25 or the Thessalonians. We want to approach the text of Daniel, in its chronology. We don't know anything about what's coming up. We're putting ourselves in Daniel's shoes. We're trying to understand what God is communicating to us from Daniel's point of view. And so we really want to negate and discount things that we know from the New Testament and that kind of stuff. What we're trying to do is to develop a biblical timeline of future events. And when we know something, when we discover something in the text of Daniel, if we can put it on a chart or a plot or something like that, we'll do so. But right now, all we have is just some attributes of the kingdom. We know the coming kingdom is going to be forever. Don't know when it's going to start. Don't know a whole lot of other things. But Daniel is going to give us some of that information, and we're going to use that to develop our timeline. One other interesting thing with the book of Daniel, the Aramaic portions in chapters 2 through 7, they actually form what's called a chiastic structure. Okay, so chiastic structure, I put it in kind of visual form, and it's essentially kind of this descending pyramid of topics that have a account and a parallel account. And the point is that the center usually contains one basic thought that's the focal point of this chiastic structure. But occasionally you'll have an even number of these points, like in Daniel chapter 2 through 8. So, for example, if you look at what some theologians and expositors have noticed, that chapter 2 and chapter 7 both contain visions of the four kingdoms. Okay, the first vision was given to Nebuchadnezzar. It's the vision of the statue with the four metals in it and that kind of stuff. And the vision of the four kingdoms is beasts in chapter 7. Okay, and you've got in the middle sections, you got a persecution type story. You've got Daniel's three friends in the fiery furnace in Daniel chapter 3, and um, the deliverance from the lion's den in chapter 6. Okay, kind of parallel accounts. And then in the middle, you've got the pride of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, um, and what God is intending to do in that respect, and the demonstration of his sovereignty. So, kind of a structure. It's just something that is interesting. Why do the Jews tend to write, or at least occasionally use chiasms in their writing? I think if you look at this outline here, it actually helps you to memorize the contents of, 5 whole chapters of the book of Daniel, chapters 2 through 7. It's a mechanism that allowed the Jews to memorize and recall scripture. So kind of neat. It's helped me to remember, what what is the contents of the different chapters, at least in the Aramaic portion. Again, the Aramaic portion in Daniel is going to begin here in chapter 2. It's going to last to the end of chapter 7, and then switches back to Hebrew. So it's been Hebrew up until then. So let's start with chapter 2, and we'll go ahead and do a reading here of the section we're going to try to cover today, starting in verse 1 in chapter 2. It says, "Now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. The king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, and here's where the text switches to the Aramaic language. It says, O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. And the king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore, declare to me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation. The king replied, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch you have seen that the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. Okay? So starting in verse 1, says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he had dreams. And we've talked a couple of different times about the Babylonian method of dating. Okay, this was the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. We know that Daniel and his friends, the text says that they were to undergo a 3-year training. And so kind of the question comes to light is, did Daniel, was he, when Nebuchadnezzar had his dreams, was Daniel still in his training, or did he finish his training? Okay, because the Babylonian method of computing the reign of a year, or the reign of the king's reign, it included or it did not include the ascension year. So Walvoord has mapped out a little, kind of a table here with the best known dates or time frames for all the events that occurred in 605. So recall May, June that Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish and chased them all the way back to Egypt. On the way, he conquered the Philistines, the Syrians, and eventually Judah, and that's where he took Jerusalem in June or August of 605. That's when Daniel and his friends were taken captive back to Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar arrived and became king, most likely on September 7th in the year 605 BC. He was made king officially, his father having died, Nabopolassar, probably a couple of weeks early, August 15th or possibly 16th in 605 BC. Okay? So, he became king on September 7th in 605. Okay? The beginning of a year is at least in the Jewish and the Near East thinking was around the April time frame. They called it the month of Nisan. So from September 7th in the fall to April 1st, that would have been 6-7 months. That would be included in Nebuchadnezzar's ascension. Okay, so it was a partial year. That's his ascension year. So that did not count when the Babylonians, accrued ruling. Okay, so and that would have been, the first couple of months of Daniel's reign, which would be at that time frame during Nebuchadnezzar's ascension. So then you go another following year, April 2nd, 604, and this is a number of days kind of thing, to March 21st, 603. That would have been Nebuchadnezzar's first complete year of his reign, but it would have been Daniel's second year of his training. And then go another year, March 22nd in 603, his title, and April 9th, 602. That would have been his second year, Nebuchadnezzar's second year, but it would have been Daniel's third year of training. Now, it's again, when did Daniel complete his training? We know that he was supposed to be in training for 3 years. Is it possible that even the number of training years that Daniel, had also used some Babylonian, where he could have actually, in the middle, 1 full year, but on each side, partial years, and that still, may have counted, at least in, for Daniel, as, a piece of a year. Close enough. Now, it's interesting. Did Daniel complete his training before or after Nebuchadnezzar had his training? There's some conflicting data here that we see. One of the arguments that could be made is if Daniel completed his training, then why wasn't he part of the group that was called initially by Nebuchadnezzar to interpret the dream? See, Daniel and his friends don't appear to be included in that group. So perhaps he didn't complete his training. However, later on, when the king says, all right, I had enough, I'm going to slay all my magicians and conjurers and all my wise men because they're not going to tell me the dream, they came looking for Daniel and his friends. They were part of that group there. So he kind of, okay, did he complete his training or didn't he? He wasn't part of the original group that was called to interpret the dream, but he was certainly part of the group that was going to be killed because nobody could interpret it. Okay? So, not sure here whether he completed his training yet or not, by that time frame. I mean, even back in chapter 1, it says that Daniel and his friends were 10 times better than even, the long-standing people that were in his court. Why wouldn't he have been part of that then? Okay? It's difficult to find a precise explanation for that, but it may have just been Daniel and his friends were 15, 16 years old. It may just be they were just too young. They have completed their training. Perhaps they completed their training, but they hadn't been presented before Nebuchadnezzar yet and quizzed and all that kind of stuff at the end of chapter 1. Those kind of things. Okay? So, not sure, why that is, but, it doesn't really detract at all from what's going on here. Just trying to figure out all the details and stuff. It's a little bit difficult. It may just be that they were too young. 15, 16-year-old, you know, I mean, they were called men, for Jews, but we would look at them, wow, teenagers, He's gonna, 15, 16, coming up and advise the king on something, business for him. So it says Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. Notice the plural. The plural is used there. It's possible that what is meant here, that Daniel used the plural dreams here, is maybe it was one single dream, but lots of aspects to it. Maybe it was the same dream over, consecutive nights, or a compilation of some things. But the point is that this dream, whatever it was, these dreams, has caused Nebuchadnezzar such anguish, okay, that he brought in, all of his wise men to try and interpret it. Now, why did he want to know the meaning of this dream so much? Well, what did the Babylonians believe about dreams? The Babylonians believed that the gods communicated through dreams. Okay, so this was an important aspect to him. He would be under the impression that the gods were trying to communicate something to him, and he didn't want to get that wrong. He wanted to precisely understand exactly what these gods were trying to communicate to him. Okay? That's probably why he was so, anxious and so upset at not knowing the interpretation of the dream. Now, why wouldn't he know the interpretation of the dream? Okay, Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean. Okay, it's known that he was a Chaldean, so he certainly at least possessed some of the knowledge and wisdom required to interpret dreams. Okay, another good question that we kind of have to interpolate from the text. Whatever the reason, he didn't have enough skill in dream interpretation to know, exactly what to do with the dream that he had. Okay, if we kind of put ourselves in his place, why does he want such an accurate interpretation? It could be just simple culture and the context of the time. Here's a rather young king that helped his father destroy the world ruling empire at the time, the Assyrians. They controlled, the known world back then. He dispensed with the Assyrians. He overthrew the Egyptians, the Philistines, Syrians, all that. And he may have sat there and thought, well, if I could overthrow the greatest kingdom in existence at the time, couldn't somebody else come and overthrow me in time? Okay, so I mean, these things certainly probably were on his mind. The other thing that's interesting is a lot of these. A lot of the way kings were succeeded in those days was assassination. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar's father came to the throne by assassinating the previous ruler, and several after Nebuchadnezzar, before the Babylonian kingdom fell, same kind of thing. So there was always, intrigue and stuff associated with these rulers, at least in Babylon. And if the if this dream was meant to try to communicate something to Nebuchadnezzar, he certainly would want to know just the details and the context of that. Okay. All right, let's go on. Let's a couple more. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, conjurers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. Okay, first piece of that. So he calls for the wise men, and the text, in depending on the translation that you're using, it may render some of these terms, these four groups of wise men that he called in, it may render them a little bit differently. We want to at least understand as best we can what each of these groups actually did, what the word in Hebrew or Aramaic means, and try to understand exactly what their role or function was as best we can. This is not going to be exact, lots probably of overlap here. But the first thing that he called in, the first group, is translated in the NASB as magicians. Magicians. Okay, this will kind of give you an idea that we want to open up our understanding of what a magician is, at least in the ancient Near East here. Magician is from the Hebrew word hartam, hartam, and though it's the same word used in the days of Moses for magician, okay, the guys that threw this rod down and made it turn into a snake, same word in the Hebrew used here. But if we were to look up the meaning in a lexicon, a Hebrew lexicon, or say Vine's expository dictionary, we'd find that the primary meaning for the word hartam, it means engraver, to engrave or to etch, or to a writer. Okay, so these were folks, and the root word means to scratch or to cut, and it really only secondarily means the word magician. Okay, so these would be people that were mostly writers. They're etching on stone or clay tablets. They're recording and writing information and stuff. Here's a paragraph from Stephen Miller. Strictly speaking, hartam seems to describe persons who wrote with a stylus on clay tablets, and in this case, the religious scribes or sacred writers who recorded and preserved the materials used in the Babylonian religious activities. Okay, so any text or literature required for all of the wisdom and knowledge in Babylon, these magicians or writers would be the ones that would inscribe that on clay and preserve it and write it on cuneiform tablets and things like that. These wise men meticulously chronicled, for example, the movements of the heavenly bodies in order to gain religious wisdom from them. Okay, so lots of different uses for someone that could write in ancient Babylonian, and that's the essential meaning of that first word that the NASB calls magicians. Magicians. KJV may have a different rendering, that kind of stuff, but the meaning of the word is someone who writes, someone who etches onto clay or something and is recording literature in some form. Okay, so the second group of people he calls in is conjurers. Conjurers. It's the rendering of the Hebrew word asap and the Aramaic word, very similar, asap. It literally means conjurer or necromancer. Okay, and these are both derived from an ancient Akkadian word. It means incantation priest. Incantation priest. So some priest in a temple that is reciting special incantations, and the imagery here is they're reciting incantations in order to communicate with the spirit world. Okay, with the dead. Okay. And I always put some statement, though Daniel and his friends may have been required to have knowledge of some of this literature that describe these incantations and all that kind of stuff, and the duties of conjurers and stuff, they certainly would have rejected the practice because it's absolutely forbidden in the Mosaic Law in multiple places. And I'll have a list of some of those passages later on. Okay, the third group that he brings in, the NASB renders that sorcerers. Sorcerers. That's from the Hebrew Mekasepim, and it likely refers to a group of people known in Akkadian texts as Kashash Apu. Can't pronounce that very well. But it's an Akkadian loan word, and it comes from the root, to practice sorcery, okay, or witchcraft, sorcery, and witchcraft. Again, what do those terms actually mean? This is sorcery or witchcraft is the belief that you have the ability to change reality by speaking some words or incantation, specially crafted to appeal to some god that may control some aspect of what you're trying to change in reality. Okay, a lot of gobbledygook, but the king and lots of rulers in the ancient Near East would have used sorcerers to protect themselves, try to bend the peacefulness of enemies and all that kind of stuff. They would use sorcerers quite a bit. It was quite widespread, in this time in the ancient world. And again, this was strictly forbidden by the Mosaic Law, unquestionably. Okay. All right. So the last group of people that he brings in is the Chaldeans, and we'll look at those a little bit more later on in the text of Daniel. But the term Chaldeans is sometimes translated astrologers, but here in NASB it's just translated Chaldeans, and it's used in Daniel. This particular word, two different ways. In one way, it's used to represent the generic Babylonian people. Okay, so back in chapter 1, it says he brought some youths into the land of the Chaldeans. Okay, back to Babylon, back to the Babylonian people. Okay, but the term's also used in a very narrow sense for a special class of his wise men that actually specialized in astrology. Astrology. So the belief that the movement of the stars and planets somehow have some bearing on an individual's fate and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you've all know a little bit about astrology just from reading a Sunday newspaper in the very back, or that kind of stuff. Kind of in this day and age we would consider that silly, but this was one of the things that the Chaldeans were known for, is their ability in astrology. And part of astrology, ironically, is being able to precisely position heavenly bodies, objects out there, stars and planets and stuff. So they actually became pretty adept at astronomy computation. So we always separate astrology, the hokey pokey, stuff about stars and planets, with astronomy, the precise physics of orbital motion and, yada, 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 stuff that I don't even know what I'm talking about now. I'm just saying the words. They were fairly adept at astronomical computations. Okay, there's a Babylonian astronomer, Naburamanu. Notice Nabu. It's in lots of names. Again, that's another nickname for one of their main gods, Nabu or Nebo. This fella, as an astronomer in 500 BC, he was able to calculate the length of a solar year, 365 days, 6 hours, 15 minutes, and 41 seconds. And how far away is he off to our known understanding of what that is? It's like 27 minutes off. In 500 BC, he could calculate the time, the time of a whole year, and he's only 27 minutes off. I mean, we use wavelengths of periods in a laser and all this kind of stuff, and compute all that stuff down to a fractions of 10 to the minus 12 seconds, just because you can today, and it's being done. So they were very adept at astronomical or astronomy computation. So those are the four kind of groups of people, and again, some of the duties and some of the specialties in those groups may have overlapped a little bit. Certainly, there would have been Chaldeans that were prolific magicians or writers and that kind of stuff. So it's not wise to separate them out so much in the text, because there's not a tremendous amount of additional information to give us gross details about what these duties were. Here's the list of passages here where some of these things are listed. Again, Daniel and his friends certainly would not have participated in any of this stuff. They may have been required to learn it. Certainly Daniel was probably required to learn the dream interpretation stuff, that at least from the Babylonian framework. But it's interesting that he didn't use any of that stuff when he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. So it was basically useless information to him. It was the Lord God that gave him the interpretation of the dream and the dream itself. Leviticus 19:20, Deuteronomy 18 is lots of information on where those practices are condemned in the Old Testament Mosaic law. So interesting is we sit and we think about all of these people that were in Nebuchadnezzar's court and advising him and stuff like that. We compare to say what our president uses, his cabinet. We got economics people and yada yada yada, all that kind of stuff. And yet way back then it was wise men, soothsayers, astronomers, magicians, conjurers, sorcerers, just kind of this mystical, religious kind of stuff that most of these nations back then, adhered to. And we look at that in today's day and age, and it's poppycock and all that kind of stuff. But if you think about it, some aspects of evolving New Age religion is starting to incorporate, kind of scarily, some of the aspects, some of this ancient Babylonian beliefs about communicating with spirits. The thing that I think is attractive to atheists or unbelievers about the New Age religion is you can have a benevolent God without any biblical requirements to submit your life to him and things like that. You look at the shows and stuff on cable, it's just laced with occult teaching and main stuff that they do. And even out there by at least it used to be by Aldi's, you got this little white building, the palm reader. You can go in and get your fate for a meager $50 or whatever. What do they charge? I don't even know. Does anyone know what they charge for that? But whatever it is, it's that much too much, right? Because it's useless. What's that? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, no, I literally, what's the going rate for conjurers these days? I don't know. I have no idea. That's funny. If someone would have said, yeah, $55, then, okay, then it would have hit me what I was just doing there. So, okay. All right. Right, exactly. All right, so you've got all of these people, and the interesting thing is that proliferation of this kind of stuff, interest in the occult. If we now, ignore what I said at first and jump to Revelation, we know that in the tribulation period, in chapter 9, where you've got the demon locusts that sting, at the end of that chapter, it says that those people were not willing to repent of their sorcery, even in the light of all of that. So we can expect this to continue to increase. And, when we're gone from the tribulation, that's going to even be, more pronounced in that period of time, the interest in all of this. Okay, so the king had a dream. He calls all of these before him, and he's anxious to understand the dream. Okay, and then here in verse 4, it says the Chaldean spoke to the king in Aramaic, and the text switches again. O king, live forever. Kind of a generic greeting of a king to, I think, butter him up a little bit for what they're going to ask. Oh king, live forever. Tell us the dream. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. Okay, things are getting a little more focused here. Now, would it have been a hard task for these Chaldeans and wise men to interpret the king's dream? No. If he told them the dream, right, they could make it up. They could say anything they wanted to. But for the most part, they had literature and manuals and that kind of stuff. They could go and look and see, hey, when you have a dream that involves the sun, it means this and that. I mean, they certainly had their manuals, and it's very interesting. They have actually found Akkadian dream manuals in archaeological digs. So these things actually existed at the time where they could go and flip through, and it'd be like you were doing a translation. That we have a Greek to English dictionary, and you're going to do a word to word. All right, let's look this up, and eventually you'll produce a translation. Eventually, they could produce an interpretation for the dream based on these manuals, and the other asset, they could really make whatever they wanted up. And would that satisfy someone that didn't know any better? Yeah, of course it would. Of course it would. It would satisfy someone that had absolutely no knowledge of this or anything. And then the interesting part of this is that Nebuchadnezzar now turns the tables on his own wise men. Okay, I think this is so fascinating because this really turns the whole story on its head here. It's something different. The king replies to the Chaldeans after their request, please tell us a dream, we'll give you the interpretation. And he replies, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb. Your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you do declare the dream and its interpretation, you'll receive from me gifts and reward and great honor. Therefore, declare to me the dream and its interpretation. Okay, so here's the interesting thing. He's not going to reveal to them the dream. Now, the question is it possible that Nebuchadnezzar forgot the dream? I mean, we have dreams a lot, and we wake up and you don't remember them. Okay, is it possible that he just forgot the dream and he wanted his wise men to tell him the dream because he had forgotten it? It's possible. And there are some expositors that do believe that. But it could be a mere translation issue. Okay? If you have a KJV, you'll notice that first phrase that Nebuchadnezzar says is, the thing is gone from me. The thing is gone from me. That, in that translation, kind of suggests that he did forget the dream. The thing is gone from me. Okay. Um, but the interesting thing is that the archaeological discoveries since 1611 and the manuscripts and stuff on some of the language that's used here. Um, there's loan words here, and the meaning of this Persian loan word here, the verb there, it really means firm or certain, and it's a slight spelling nuance that may cause this. The King James translators believe that it was derived from the Aramaic word azda, but it's actually not quite that. So most expositors today would translate this firm. Okay, in other words, I've made up my mind. I am not backing down from it. Tell me the dream and its interpretation, not that I've forgotten the dream. But it doesn't matter if he forgot the dream or not. Again, it doesn't. It doesn't really detract from what's going to happen here. Okay. All right. So let's just assume for now that he knew what the dream was, and this was kind of his plan. Um, what would the purpose be in him not telling the dream? So he knew the dream. Why would he not tell uh, his wise men? Okay, I think there's probably lots of reasons. He may have been fairly suspicious of whether or not his wise men could do this or not, and he's kind of testing them, a little test. Okay, certainly Nebuchadnezzar, probably a young king. All these wise men are all the leftovers from his father's kingdom. They're probably older fellas, and at that point he may have thought, what these old men are trying to steer me in a wrong direction or things like that. He seemed to be very distrustful of his own wise men, and so he makes this threat. He says, "Look, if you don't make this dream known to me, I'm going to tear you limb from limb." Okay, now I I didn't know that that's where that expression actually came from. I'll tear you limb from limb. Popeye or something. That kind of stuff. I mean, does that mean he was gonna slice them into pieces, or some other ancient cultures would use horses or animals and literally pull you apart and that kind of stuff? Whatever that is, it's clear that the death is implied here. You don't tell me the dream and its interpretation, I will kill you. I will kill you. And he says, I'll make your houses a rubbish heap. And that's an interesting word. I think it literally means not just a garbage heap. We're going to tear your house down. I think it literally means we're going to turn your house into a public bathroom, a public latrine. The people are going to come soil themselves in your house. That's not a house anymore. He was a pretty creative guy when it came to penalties, that kind of stuff. But the imagery there is bad things will happen to you, your family, your house, if you don't give me the interpretation here. Okay. Now, what about the rewards? Well, fairly generic terms that are used here: rewards and gifts and honor. It could be material, could be promotion, maybe even a daughter for marriage, things like that. It doesn't really say what Nebuchadnezzar promised, but if we go to the end of chapter 2, the last couple of verses, we could see that what he actually gave Daniel at the end of the story: a promotion, made him ruler and chief prefect over Babylon, and appointed his friends as administrators, that kind of stuff. So whatever the promises were, maybe some of those things Daniel didn't really want. Maybe didn't want the king's daughter or something like that for a wife. But the text at least tells us what Nebuchadnezzar actually did give to him, and it was more promotion within the kingdom type of rewards. And so that's good. So the wise men follow up. You know, not sure we heard the king all that well. Let's ask him again. Let's ask him again. They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell the dream to his servants, and when we will declare the interpretation." Okay, um, you know, it's pretty clear that Nebuchadnezzar at this point he kind of knows and figures that if he tells them the dream, they are going to give him something, and he's still, if he's sure that they're going to relay the interpretation of this dream accurately, they got to pass the first test and tell him what the dream is, and he will eventually get to that eventually. So this is interesting, and here's the king's second reply. Okay, so he's clearly getting frustrated now. Okay, he says, the king replied, "I know for certain that you're bargaining for time, inasmuch you have seen that the command from me is firm." Okay, and I think that lends, credence to the translation of the previous couple verses up there. That my decision is firm. Okay, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you: death. You know, for you have agreed. This is interesting. That this next piece of it shows you how distrusting Nebuchadnezzar is of his own wise men. He says, "For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed." He is very distrusting of his own wise men. This is, if there was ever a time for him to clean house, boy, this is it. He could get rid of all of his horrible advisors in one fell swoop. And this is I mean, these guys claim that they can communicate with the spirit world. That was like their job. They claim that they could interpret dreams, that they would be able to tell what the gods are speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. That was their claim. And he's testing them in this claim. I think fairly clever. So the second, again, this request is interesting. And one of the things that we'll get to when we actually get to the dream is one of the aspects or one of the symbols that's in the dream that may really be pushing Nebuchadnezzar in his anxiety and his fury against his wise men is the imagery of a mountain in his dream. That actually is one of the more critical aspects of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The fact that there was a mountain in his dream. See, the Babylonians believed that the gods actually came from the mountains, and that the whole earth they called, the mountain of the land. Okay, so they believed, profusely that all their gods they came from and lived, um, in the mountains. That's why they built temples on some mountains, or made them tall and large to emulate a mountain. Okay, so it was an important aspect to them. One of the chief gods, the chief god Marduk, one of his other names was the Great Mountain. The Great Mountain. He was the chief Babylonian god. One of his names was the Great Mountain. So this was an important aspect to this particular dream, and it's interesting that God would use something in Nebuchadnezzar's dream that he could intimately relate to in his religion. This was an important aspect of why God used the mountain imagery, is so that Nebuchadnezzar would at least get in his mind and the idea in his head that what is being portrayed in this dream was divine revelation. Okay, was divine revelation, and that was an important aspect of it. And God purposefully used that mountain imagery, and especially the part where a stone is cut out of that mountain without hands. Okay, that's how they built temples. They cut stones with hands and made temples and stuff like that. The imagery of a stone cut out of a mountain without hands was also the imagery of divine influence. And so God used this imagery to communicate to Nebuchadnezzar what his plan was for establishing his kingdom and his rulership over the span of human history. And we're going to get into that. But again, the whole point is in some of this imagery is that Nebuchadnezzar, and it may be one reason why he turned the table on his magicians. He knew that this was going to be divine communication. He wanted to make sure that the interpretation was correct, and the only way he could do that is also make his wise men tell him what the dream was. I mean, after all, the very last thing he says in verse 9 there says, "Tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation." Okay, that was the whole focal point. If they could tell him the dream, he'd have some pretty good confidence that they could give him the correct interpretation. Okay, let's stop there. Any questions, comments, snide remarks? All that is good. Yes, Chris. Yes. Yes, the text of Daniel uses it in a couple of different ways, but they were an ethnic group. And Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean himself. Okay, the particular class of wise men in that group were known for their astronomy and astrology and things like that. And it's interesting that many expositors believe that the Magi that came from the east to worship Christ. Okay, why did they come? They saw the stars. Okay, it's suspected that these magi were probably Chaldeans that were aware. They saw in the star, something's going on here. This big bright star that we didn't predict was going to be there. We want to go find out what this is all about. So it's suspected. Yeah. Like, yeah, like for instance, some of the prophecies of the coming Christ in Bethlehem and that kind of, yeah, very possible that not only was he instructing or was being instructed by Babylonians, I'm sure it went the other way. Whether or not he had a copy of the Old Testament that he brought with him or scrolls or stuff. The text of Daniel doesn't really say anywhere, but he certainly knew enough of the Hebrew scriptures that he could recite them and quote them and at least have some knowledge and stuff. And the other thing is, remember that Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, well, Ezekiel and Jeremiah, they were contemporaries of Daniel. So those prophecies probably weren't given yet. Isaiah was a couple of hundred years prior to that, so he would have had knowledge of some of Isaiah's prophecy concerning the Messiah. So that's what he could have dispensed to the Babylonians too. But then over time, even the Babylonians probably would have collected Jewish literature after the prophets were written. I don't know how much they studied it and stuff like that. By the time of Christ, they may have been familiar, with enough to, hey, we want to go check this out, see what's going on here in Jerusalem or Bethlehem. So, Okay, any others? All right, next week we'll try to cover the next section. Things get more interesting as you know the Chaldeans actually they give the whole thing away, and that here these are the guys that claim they could speak to the gods, and yet in the end they say no, only a God could tell you the meaning of the dream, and you think, wait a second, you're supposed to be speaking to them, and they can't do it. So they eventually put all their marbles on the table, and for all purposes admit we got nothing here. So okay, dismiss.